The explosion came without warning, as they always did. One moment, Captain Sarah Chen was coordinating the evacuation of wounded Afghan National Army soldiers from a bombed-out compound in Helmand Province, and the next, the world disappeared in a flash of orange fire and twisted metal. The Taliban had waited until the medical convoy was fully committed to the rescue before detonating the secondary IED. It was a textbook ambush, executed with the kind of patient brutality that separated the experienced fighters from the desperate amateurs. When the smoke cleared and her hearing returned enough to make out the screaming, Sarah found herself pinned under the wreckage of what had been a Humvee door. Blood was running down her face from somewhere above her left eye, and her right leg felt like it was on fire. But none of that mattered because 30 meters away, through the haze of dust and cordite, she could see Private Rodriguez trying to drag Corporal Williams toward the tree line while Taliban muzzle flashes lit up the hillside like deadly fireflies. She would think about that moment often in the years that followed, not because of the pain or the fear, but because of the choice. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds long, when she could have stayed put, could have waited for the dust to settle and help to arrive, could have played it safe and let someone else be the hero. But Rodriguez was 19 years old and 7 months out of basic training, and Williams had a wife and twin daughters waiting for him back in Ohio. So Sarah pushed the twisted metal off her chest, ignored the fire in her leg, and ran. The Taliban fighters had excellent fields of fire from their position on the ridge. Sarah knew this because she had studied the terrain extensively before the mission. She also knew that they would be expecting her to take the direct route to her wounded soldiers, which meant crossing 40 meters of open ground with no cover except for a burned-out Toyota pickup that wouldn't stop a .22 caliber round, much less the 7.62 ammunition that was currently chewing up the dirt around her feet. Instead, she went left. The irrigation ditch was mostly dry, filled with nothing but rocks and the occasional thorny bush, but it provided a concealed route to within 10 meters of where Rodriguez was trying to perform first aid on Williams while incoming rounds cracked over their heads. Sarah low-crawled through that ditch like her life depended on it, because it did, along with the lives of 2 soldiers who had volunteered for this mission because they trusted her judgment. She reached them just as Rodriguez's rifle jammed. The kid was fumbling with the charging handle, his hands shaking from adrenaline and inexperience, when Sarah slid into position beside him. Williams was conscious but going into shock from blood loss. His femoral artery had been nicked by shrapnel, and Rodriguez had done a decent job with the tourniquet, but they needed to get him to a surgeon within the next 20 minutes or he was going to bleed out in an Afghan irrigation ditch. "Can you carry him?" Sarah asked Rodriguez, having to shout over the gunfire. "Yes, ma'am, but they've got us pinned down. Soon as we move, they'll cut us to pieces." Sarah looked up at the ridge, counting muzzle flashes. At least 6 shooters, maybe 8. Professional spacing, good discipline. These weren't farmers with AK-47s. These were experienced fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. "Give me a rifle," she told Rodriguez. "Ma'am? Your rifle, give it to me. When I start shooting, you pick up Williams and you run for that tree line. Don't stop, don't look back, just run." Rodriguez stared at her like she had lost her mind. "Ma'am, that's suicide. They'll focus all their fire on you." "That's the idea, son. Now give me your rifle and get ready to move." What happened next would be argued about in after-action reports for months. Some would say that Sarah Chen made a tactical error born of desperation and inexperience. Others would argue that she made the only choice available to a leader who understood that some missions require sacrifice. What nobody could argue with were the results. Sarah Chen stood up in that irrigation ditch and opened fire on 8 hardened Taliban fighters positioned on high ground with excellent cover and superior numbers. She fired with the kind of precision that came from countless hours on the range and the absolute certainty that missing was not an option. Her first 3 rounds took out the machine gunner who had been keeping them pinned down. Her next burst suppressed the 2 riflemen who were trying to flank their position. And when her magazine ran dry, she reloaded and kept shooting while Rodriguez carried Williams to safety. She held that position for 97 seconds, long enough for Rodriguez to reach the tree line and for the quick reaction force to establish a base of fire from the compound they had been evacuating, long enough for Williams to live. Long enough to prove that sometimes the difference between a good soldier and a great one comes down to 97 seconds of absolute courage under fire. The piece of shrapnel that caught her in the face came from a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded against the rocks 3 feet from her position. It should have killed her instantly. Instead, it carved a line from her left ear to the corner of her mouth and temporarily blinded her in one eye. When the medics found her 20 minutes later, she was still in that ditch, still conscious, still asking about the status of her soldiers. The plastic surgeon at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center did excellent work. 3 operations and 6 months of recovery time later, the scar was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. But Sarah Chen knew where to look. Every morning when she shaved her legs and applied her makeup and chose her clothes, she looked at that thin line of damaged tissue and remembered what it cost to earn respect in a profession that didn't always want to give it. 5 years later, she would walk into an Army recruitment office in downtown Atlanta and watch as every conversation stopped and every head turned, because despite everything she had done and everything she had sacrificed, Sarah Chen looked like the kind of woman who belonged on magazine covers, not in combat zones. And that, she had learned, was both her greatest advantage and her most persistent challenge. The recruitment office occupied the ground floor of a converted shopping mall, wedged between a nail salon and a store that sold cellular phone accessories. It was not the most dignified location for the business of defending America, but it was convenient and accessible, and it attracted the kind of foot traffic that kept recruiters busy. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres had been working this particular office for 3 years, and he thought he had seen every type of person who might wander through those glass doors. There were the 18-year-olds fresh out of high school, full of patriotic fervor and video game fantasies about military service. There were the older men going through midlife crises, convinced that a stint in the National Guard would recapture some lost sense of purpose. There were the concerned parents, asking careful questions about deployment schedules and education benefits. And there were the girlfriends and wives, sometimes supportive, sometimes terrified, always emotional. When the blonde woman walked through the door at exactly 9 in the morning, Torres automatically placed her in the last category. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was attractive, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum with mechanical precision. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail that caught the fluorescent lights just right, and her makeup had been applied with the skill of someone who understood that first impressions mattered in whatever business she was in. Torres had nothing against attractive women. He was happily married to one. But experience had taught him that the prettier they were, the more likely they were to be problems. Beautiful women in recruitment offices usually meant one of 3 things. They were looking for their boyfriends, they were trying to talk their boyfriends out of enlisting, or they were lost and looking for directions to somewhere else. "Good morning," she said, approaching his desk with a smile that was warm but somehow professional. "I was hoping someone could help me with a records request." Torres nodded and reached for the standard civilian paperwork. "Of course, ma'am. Are you looking for information about a family member? Spouse, maybe?" "Something like that," she replied, opening a leather purse that probably cost more than Torres made in a week. But instead of pulling out a driver's license or a photograph, she withdrew a military ID card and placed it on his desk. Torres blinked and looked more closely. "Captain Sarah Chen, United States Army." He looked up at her, then back at the ID, then at her again. "I'm sorry, Captain. I didn't realize." "It happens all the time," she said, waving off his apology with the kind of grace that suggested she really had dealt with this before. "May I sit down?" "Of course, ma'am. Please." Torres gestured to the chair across from his desk, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the woman in front of him with his mental image of what an army captain should look like. She was too put together, too polished. Most of the officers he knew carried themselves differently, with a kind of institutional weariness that came from years of dealing with military bureaucracy and impossible missions. Behind him, the usual morning activity had slowed to a crawl. Corporal Jackson was pretending to organize files while stealing glances. Even Master Sergeant Williams, who had been in the army long enough to see everything twice, had looked up from his computer screen to watch this interaction play out. "What kind of records are you looking for, ma'am?" Torres asked, trying to regain his professional composure. Captain Chen reached into her purse again and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. "Actually, I think there might be some confusion in my file. I wanted to make sure everything was up to date before my next assignment." She placed the folder on his desk. Would you mind taking a look at this? I think there might be some discrepancies. Torres opened the folder, expecting to see standard personnel files, maybe some awards paperwork that needed correcting. Instead, he found himself staring at a DD Form 214 discharge document. Except this wasn't a discharge. This was a record of service for someone who was very much still active duty. And as Torres read through the citations, decorations, and deployment history, his expression changed from polite interest to complete shock. 3 Purple Hearts, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The office had gone completely quiet now. Even the phone seemed to have stopped ringing. Captain Chen nodded. The first one was Kandahar, 2018. IED blast took out our convoy. I was the only one who walked away from that one. Torres kept reading. Bronze Star with Valor device, Afghanistan, 2019. For actions during enemy contact when... He looked up at her. When you pulled wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle under heavy fire. That was a long day, she said simply. Combat Action Badge, Airborne Wings, Ranger Tab. Torres was struggling to process what he was seeing. Ma'am, this says you've done 15 combat deployments. 16 now, she corrected. Just got back from Syria last month. From the back of the office, a young voice spoke up. No way. You making this up? The words hung in the air like a challenge.
Torres felt his stomach drop as he turned to see Private First Class Danny Morrison, 19 years old and fresh out of basic training, standing by the file cabinets with an expression of pure disbelief on his face. Captain Chen turned slowly to face Morrison, her expression remaining pleasant but something harder flickering in her eyes. Excuse me? Morrison, clearly too young and too inexperienced to recognize the danger he was walking into, took a step forward. I mean, no offense, ma'am, but you look like you should be on a magazine cover or something, not in a foxhole. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torres wanted to intervene, to save Morrison from whatever was about to happen, but he found himself frozen in place, waiting to see how Captain Chen would respond. She smiled, and somehow that was more terrifying than if she had exploded in anger. You're right, she said. I was on a magazine cover once. Cosmopolitan, 2016. Beauty and Brains, America's Most Inspiring Women. It was a stupid article, but the photographer was talented. Morrison blinked, clearly not expecting that response. The thing is, Captain Chen continued, taking a step closer to the young soldier. That photo was taken 3 weeks after I got back from my 8th deployment. I'd been in country for 9 months, lost 15 pounds, and hadn't worn makeup in so long I'd forgotten how to apply eyeliner properly. But the magazine wanted to show that military women could be feminine and strong, so they spent 4 hours making me look like someone I barely recognized. Torres noticed something he had missed before. The way she moved wasn't the careful, practiced walk of someone trying to look good in heels. It was controlled, balanced, ready. Like someone who had spent years moving through hostile territory where a wrong step could mean death. The funny thing about combat, Captain Chen said, her voice still conversational, is that it doesn't care what you look like. Bullets don't discriminate based on your bone structure. IEDs don't check your makeup before they explode. And when your brothers are bleeding out in the dirt, they don't care if you're pretty enough to be a real soldier. They just care if you're good enough to keep them alive. Morrison had gone pale, but he wasn't backing down. But ma'am, I mean, you just don't look like... Like what? Captain Chen asked. Like someone who's killed 17 enemy combatants in direct action? Like someone who's performed emergency surgery with a bayonet because the medic was dead and the helicopter couldn't land? Like someone who's made decisions that saved lives and taken actions that ended them? She reached up and touched her left cheek, where Torres now noticed a thin line of scar tissue partially concealed by expertly applied makeup. This is from Helmand Province, 2019.
Piece of shrapnel from an RPG that should have taken my head off. Plastic surgery, 3 operations. The doctors did good work, but you can still see it if you know where to look. Master Sergeant Williams had been quiet through the entire exchange, but now he stood up from his desk in the corner. At 52, he was old enough to have seen 3 wars and experienced enough to recognize something that the younger soldiers had missed. "Captain," he said carefully, "that Bronze Star citation, Operation Enduring Freedom 2019. You were with the 173rd Airborne?" "Yes, Master Sergeant." Williams nodded slowly. "I know that operation. Different unit, but we all heard about what you did. They said someone went back into a burning MRAP 3 times to pull out casualties. Saved 7 soldiers while taking fire from 3 different positions." The room was completely silent now. Even Morrison had stopped talking.
"They also said," Williams continued, "that the soldier who did it got hit by shrapnel on the 3rd trip. Took a piece of metal to the face that should have taken her eye out, but she finished the job anyway."
Captain Chen's professional composure slipped slightly. "It was just what needed to be done." But Williams wasn't finished. "What they didn't put in the official reports," he said, "was what happened after. How that same soldier spent 18 hours in surgery and then refused evacuation because her unit was still in contact. How she stayed on the line with a bandaged face and an IV in her arm, coordinating air support until the mission was complete." Torres found his voice. "Ma'am, why didn't you say anything? When I assumed you were—" "Because it happens every time," Captain Chen said, settling back into her chair. "I walk into a room and people see what they expect to see. A pretty face, expensive clothes, someone who's never had dirt under her fingernails or gun oil on her hands." She opened her purse and pulled out a small compact mirror, checking her reflection with the unconscious precision of someone who had made this routine automatic. "You know what the hardest part about being a female soldier isn't? It's not the physical training. It's not the combat deployments. It's not even the IEDs or the firefights." "What is it?" Torres asked. "It's that you have to be twice as good to get half the respect. And even then, someone's always going to question whether you really belong." She snapped the compact shut. "So I learned to play the game. I learned to smile and nod when people underestimate me. I learned to let my record speak for itself." Morrison, who had been shifting uncomfortably throughout this exchange, finally found his voice again. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's fine, Marine," Captain Chen said, then caught herself. "Sorry, soldier. Old habits. But let me ask you something. What do you think makes a real soldier?" Morrison straightened up, recognizing that this was still a teaching moment despite his earlier mistake. "Courage? Dedication? Willingness to fight for your country?" "Good answer. Textbook answer." She nodded approvingly. "What else?" "Physical fitness? Marksmanship? Tactical knowledge?" "Also good. What about experience?" "Yes, ma'am. Combat experience." Captain Chen stood up and walked over to the wall where various recruiting posters hung. She stopped in front of one that showed a young soldier in full combat gear, looking determined and heroic. This poster shows exactly what people think a soldier should look like. Strong, serious, probably male, definitely not someone who spends time on their appearance. She turned back to face the room. But here's the thing about war. It's not a poster. It's not a movie. It's chaos and confusion and split-second decisions that determine whether people live or die. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos. "This is me in Afghanistan, 2019. She held up the screen. The woman in the photo was barely recognizable, covered in dust and blood, her face streaked with exhaustion, her uniform torn and stained. But her eyes were alert, focused, alive. "This is me in Syria, 2023. Another photo, this time showing her helping load wounded civilians into a medical helicopter. Her blonde hair was dark with sweat and dirt, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. "And this," she said, showing one final photo, "is me at the Bronze Star ceremony 3 months later." The final photo showed Captain Chen in her dress uniform, standing at attention as a general pinned the medal to her chest. She looked exactly like she did now, polished, professional, beautiful. "Same person," she said quietly. "Same soldier, same warrior. The only difference is the setting." Master Sergeant Williams cleared his throat. "Captain, if you don't mind me asking, why are you here today? What's the real reason you needed to check your records?" Captain Chen's expression grew serious. "Because I'm up for promotion to major, and there's a review board next week that's going to look at my file and make the same assumptions everyone else makes." Her professional composure slipped slightly. "I've been passed over twice. Both times the feedback was the same, questions about my leadership presence and whether I had the command bearing necessary for the next level." "That's bullshit," Morrison said, then immediately looked mortified. "Sorry, ma'am. No, soldier, you're right. It is bullshit." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've led soldiers through some of the most dangerous operations in modern warfare. I've made decisions under fire that saved lives. I've earned every decoration in this file through blood and sacrifice. But because I don't look like their idea of a warrior, I'm still fighting for respect." Torres leaned forward. "What can we do to help?" "Nothing," she said. "That's the point. I have to do this myself. I have to walk into that boardroom next week and prove once again that I belong, that I'm not just a pretty face playing soldier." "But you shouldn't have to," Williams said. "No, I shouldn't. But this is the military, Master Sergeant. We play by the rules we're given, not the rules we wish we had." The office door opened and Colonel James Harper walked in. He was a tall man in his 50s, with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. Everyone in the room stood up automatically. "As you were," he said, then stopped when he saw Captain Chen. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" "Hello, Colonel," she said, her demeanor shifting to something more formal.
"Just checking on some paperwork." Colonel Harper's eyes moved to the documents spread across Torres's desk. "Mind if I take a look?" Captain Chen hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, sir." Harper picked up the service record and began reading, his eyebrows rising slightly as he scanned the list of decorations and deployments. "Jesus, Sarah. I knew you were good, but this is..." "Intimidating?" she suggested. "Impressive," he corrected. "I've been in the Army for 28 years and I don't have half the combat experience you do." The room was watching this exchange with fascination. Here was a senior officer treating Captain Chen with the kind of respect that her record deserved, not the patronizing attitude she had been receiving all morning. "Sir," she said carefully, "can I ask you something? If you saw me walking down the street in civilian clothes, what would you think?" Harper considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I'd probably think you were a model or an actress, someone who'd never had a hard day in their life. And if you didn't know my record and you saw me in uniform?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'd probably wonder how you got your commission, whether you'd earned it or..." "Thank you for being honest." "But that would make me an idiot," Harper continued, "because anyone who's actually worked with you knows exactly what you're capable of. The problem isn't your appearance, Sarah. The problem is that too many people in this military still think they can judge a soldier's worth by looking at them." Harper turned to address the room. "Gentlemen, let me tell you about Captain Chen. 2 years ago, I was a lieutenant colonel commanding a forward operating base in Syria. We had intelligence about a high-value target, a terrorist leader who was coordinating attacks against our forces. The mission was volunteers only because the chances of coming back alive were about 50-50. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. Captain Chen was the first to volunteer, not because she was reckless, but because she'd studied the target area better than anyone else. She knew the terrain, she knew the enemy patterns,
and she knew how to get our people in and out safely. Captain Chen was looking uncomfortable with the attention, but Harper continued. The mission was a success. We captured the target, recovered valuable intelligence, and all our people came home. But what you don't see in the official reports is what happened when we took contact on the way out. Torres found himself leaning forward, caught up in the story despite himself. An IED disabled our lead vehicle, and we were taking fire from 3 directions. Sarah was in the second vehicle. She had 2 choices: stay with her unit and fight from cover, or run across 50 meters of open ground under fire to help the wounded soldiers in the lead vehicle. What did she do? Morrison asked. She ran, Harper said simply. Through gunfire, through smoke, through chaos. She reached the disabled vehicle, pulled out 3 wounded soldiers, and got them to safety. Then she went back for the driver. Captain Chen was staring at the floor now, clearly uncomfortable with having her actions described in such detail. But here's the part that really impressed me, Harper continued. When it was all over, when the casualties were evacuated and the target was in custody, Sarah came to me and apologized. She said she was sorry for leaving her assigned position without orders. He shook his head. I told her then what I'm telling you now. Leadership isn't about following orders blindly. It's about making the right choice when nobody else can make it for you. And Sarah Chen has been making the right choices under impossible circumstances for longer than most of you have been in the military. Morrison stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Captain, I owe you an apology. When you walked in here, I saw what I expected to see, and I said things that were disrespectful. Captain Chen looked up at him. You said things that I've heard 1,000 times before. The difference is that today, someone spoke up for me. Someone who actually knows what I've done. Harper nodded. Which brings me to why I'm here, Sarah. I have news about your promotion board. Her expression tightened. Bad news? The opposite. The board was moved up. It's this afternoon at 1400 hours, and I'm the senior member. He smiled. After reviewing your file, your complete file, I can tell you that the board won't be focusing on your command presence or your appearance. They'll be looking at your record of service, your leadership under fire, and your potential for future assignments. Sir, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just show up at 1400 and be yourself. The real you, the soldier you've always been. After Colonel Harper left, the office remained quiet for several minutes. Finally, Torres spoke up. Captain, I owe you an apology too. When you walked in here, I made assumptions. I treated you like a civilian. It's okay, Sergeant, really. No, it's not okay. I'm supposed to be a professional. I'm supposed to recognize a fellow soldier when I see one. Captain Chen gathered her paperwork and stood up. Can I tell you something? All of you? They nodded. The hardest part about being underestimated isn't the frustration. It's not even the anger. It's the temptation to prove yourself in ways that don't matter. To get louder. To get tougher. To try to become someone else's idea of what a soldier should be. She smoothed down her blazer. I spent my first few years in the army trying to be more like the men around me. I cut my hair short. I stopped wearing makeup. I tried to make myself smaller and less noticeable. I thought if I could just blend in, I'd be accepted. What changed? Williams asked. I realized that I wasn't serving my country to blend in. I was serving to stand out, to be the best soldier I could be, not the best imitation of someone else. She picked up her purse and headed toward the door. The military is changing, slowly but surely, and it's changing because people like me, people who don't fit the traditional mold, keep showing up and proving that we belong. Ma'am? Morrison called out as she reached the door. Good luck with your promotion board. She turned back and smiled, the same warm, genuine smile she'd given Torres when she first walked in. Thank you, soldier. And remember, the next time someone walks through that door, try to listen to their story before you decide what you think you know about them. At 1500 hours, Torres's phone rang. It was Colonel Harper. Sergeant, I wanted to let you know that Captain Chen's promotion board went very well. She'll be Major Chen by the end of the week. That's great news, sir. She deserves it. She does. And I wanted to thank you and your team for how you handled things this morning. It meant a lot to her." After Torres hung up, he looked around the office. Morrison was helping an elderly veteran with his benefits paperwork, taking extra time to explain each form. Williams was speaking with a young woman in civilian clothes, listening carefully to her questions about joining the military. Maybe they were all learning something. 3 months later, Major Sarah Chen walked back into the recruitment office. This time, she was in her dress uniform, her new rank insignia gleaming on her shoulders, her ribbons and decorations displayed in perfect order. The office went quiet again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from respect. "Congratulations, Major," Torres said, standing as she approached his desk. "Thank you, Sergeant. I wanted to stop by and thank you for how you handled things that day. It meant more than you know." She turned to Morrison, who was standing at attention by the file cabinets. "How are you doing, soldier?" "Very well, ma'am. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about listening to people's stories." "Good. That's all any of us can ask for. The chance to be heard before we're judged." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and Sergeant Torres? That young woman who was here yesterday, asking about officer training, the one who seemed nervous about whether she was military material." "Yes, ma'am." "She reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who had to learn that being different doesn't mean being less than. Make sure she knows that, will you?" "Absolutely, ma'am." Major Chen walked out into the afternoon sun, her heels clicking on the linoleum one last time. But this time everyone in the office knew exactly what they were hearing. The sound of a warrior walking proud, carrying herself with the quiet confidence that came from finally being seen for who she really was. In the weeks that followed, Torres found himself thinking often about that morning, about assumptions and respect, about courage and recognition. He had always considered himself a good soldier and a fair man, but Captain Chen had shown him that good intentions weren't enough, that sometimes respect had to be earned through understanding, not just given through politeness. The recruitment office continued its steady rhythm of activity. Young men and women came through those doors every day, each carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own fears about military service. And Torres made sure to listen to those stories, really listen, before making any judgments about who belonged in uniform and who didn't. Because he had learned, from a woman who looked like a model but fought like a warrior, that the most important battles aren't always the ones fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought in recruitment offices and boardrooms, and anywhere else where people have to prove that they deserve the respect their service has already earned. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to witness it, you get to see someone win one of those battles. Not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet dignity and unshakable strength. Through the simple act of standing up and saying, "This is who I am, this is what I've done, and I belong here." Major Sarah Chen had won her battle that day, not just for herself, but for every soldier who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what a warrior should look like. She had proven that strength comes in many forms, that courage can't be measured by appearance, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon a soldier can carry is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who they are and what they're worth. In the end, that was the real story. Not just about a woman who looked like a model but fought like a warrior, but about the moment when everyone in that room finally learned to see past the surface and recognize the soldier underneath. And in that moment of recognition, something important changed. Not just for Major Chen, but for everyone who witnessed it. Because that's what real stories do. They change people. They open eyes and hearts and minds. They remind us that every person we meet is carrying a story we know nothing about, and that the least we can do is listen before we judge. Major Sarah Chen had told her story, and in doing so, she had changed everything.